Let's continue our series on middle game strategies. In this video, I'm going to show you how to play positions with an open center. I'm going to cover both attacking and defensive strategies, and I'm going to show you examples from gameplay of 4 different world champions. In positions where neither side has any pawns in the center, there's plenty of room for other pieces to move freely from one part of the board to another. As a result, the game becomes very fast-paced where every move, every tempo matters. Positional elements that are important in this type of positions are control over the center, activity of your pieces, control of the open files, and control of the open diagonals. The defensive strategy in these positions consists of 3 stages. In the first stage, you are maneuvering your pieces to control the center, central files, and diagonals. In the second stage, you're using the advantage that you achieved in the first stage to create weaknesses in your opponent's position. And in the third and final stage, you're attacking those weaknesses. The defensive plan is the exact opposite. You're trying to fight for control of the center, fight for control of the open files and diagonals, try not to create any new weaknesses, and try to defend the weaknesses you already have. Now let's see how world champions play this type of positions. The first game we're going to look at was played between Reti on the white side and Alekhine on the black side. Here we have a position with an open center, and in the next couple of moves, both sides are fighting for the control of the center, open files, and diagonals. Alekhine continued with Rook e8, and White responded with Rook d1. Alekhine took control of the semi-open file, put some pressure on the pawn on e2, and Reti took control of the open d file and started to eye the queen on d8. Bishop g4, developing the last minor piece and putting more pressure on the pawn on e2. Rook d2, defending the rook and opening up d1 square for the second rook. Queen c8, getting away from this x-ray and also starting to look at the king's side. Knight c5. White has a slight advantage in the center and on the queen side, and so decides to create a weakness in the black position by playing b4, b5, trading on c6, and then piling up on c6 pawn. Bishop h3. Black wants to trade White's bishop on g2. This bishop does a couple of things. It occupies a very strong diagonal on g2. It puts a lot of pressure on d5 and a4, and it defends light squares around the king. So black wants to trade it, and for the same reasons, white does not want to trade the bishops. Bishop g4, bishop h1, Reti basically doesn't want to trade the bishop and doesn't want to go to g2 and allow black to repeat the position. So here, Alekhine decided to create a weakness on g3 by playing h5, h4, trading on g3. So he pushed h5, and White continued with his plan of playing b4 and b5 and creating a weakness on c6. a6, before continuing with his plan on the king side, Alekhine wants to slow down the progress of White on the queen side. Rook c1. Normally, White would want to play a4 with the idea of b5. However, here after h4, b5, Black can simply capture on b5, and because of the pin, the pawn on a4 cannot capture on b5. So to avoid this pin, instead of a4, White plays Rook c1. Black continues with h4, a4, trade on g3, trades on g3. And White here, Black continues to attack to pile up on g3 pawn. And also, the trade on g3 created another weakness in White camp. Notice how the only piece that defends this pawn on g3 is the pawn on f2. However, this same pawn on f2 has another mission. It defends the square on e3. Without this pawn, threats like knight e3 become quite possible. And so Alekhine finds a way to use the fact that this pawn is overloaded to create more weaknesses in White's position. b5. White continues with his plan. Over here, White had a much better alternative. White could play e4, getting rid of the weakness on e2, putting a pawn on e4, and starting to control several central squares, and also chasing the knight from d5. And if, for example, knight goes to e7, now it interferes with the rook. However, white didn't do this, and instead white played b5. Black traded on b5, white took back, and so now there are a couple of plans that black can pursue. One is rook e7 and rook e8, and attacking the pawn on a2, putting more pressure on a2. The next one is to attack the pawn on g3 with knight h5 or rook a3. The plan with rook e7 is a little bit too slow. White's main idea is to trade on c6, play knight b3, and then capture on c6, cleaning up black's queen side, ending up with an extra pawn and the ability to move back the pieces and defend his king side. So the rook e7 plan is just too slow. The plans with knight h5 attacking the pawn on g3 would work, but after bishop d5, pawn takes on d5, queen takes d5, white has an extra pawn. The queen is now can get back to defense of the king, and the position is better for white. The other alternatives is rook a3, attacking the pawn on g3 this way, threatening to capture. So if rook b1, for example, rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes on g3, bishop g2, and now the weakness of the e3 square comes in handy, and black attacks the queen, but more importantly, attacks the bishop on g2 with a checkmate, and white cannot stop the checkmate. So that's an interesting threat, but white doesn't have to just stand there and play back. The main idea here is to take, and knight b3, but the same idea can be accomplished with just starting with knight b3, blocking the rook and renewing the threat of capturing on c6. And so what do? Alekhine here finds a very elegant way of putting more pressure on the pawn on g3. He plays rook e3. And now if white were to capture, same combination that we saw earlier with queen g3, bishop g2, and knight e3, with no defense against the checkmate on g2. So white cannot capture on e3. Instead, white plays knight f3, putting the knight between the rook and the pawn. Pawn takes on b5. Here Alekhine wants to divert this queen from the c4 square, or rather lure it away from the c4 square, so that he can play knight c3, putting more pressure on the pawn on e2. Queen takes b7. White captures the pawn and offers queen trades. There isn't really much black can do. If the queen goes away, this rook is going to be hanging. So black takes on b7, white takes on b7, and black captures on e2 with a check. King h2. So now if white captures on c1, if black captures on c1, white captures on e3, and the material is even, and yes, the pawn structure is a little bit bad for white, but this is most likely a draw. Even if white loses the pawn on e3, the position is fairly drawish. So Alekhine doesn't want a draw, and so he doesn't take on c1. Instead, he brings another piece into the attack. And notice how this initiative that black had on the king side before the queen trade still exists, and the attack's still ongoing. Right now, there are two threats, the knight c1 and knight d2. And white plays rook c4, defending one of the rooks. And if instead of rook c4, white were to capture here, then black would capture on d2 and capture on c1, and ending up with an extra material. So obviously white doesn't want to get there, so white plays rook c4. And here, black takes on f2. If black were to capture on d2, then after knight d2, rook d3, and knight c5, we're back into even position. The rook is hanging. If rook takes, bishop takes, and again, even material and very likely a draw. So instead of that, Alekhine captures on f2, creating a very simple threat of taking on h1, and after king takes on h1, bishop f3, with winning extra material. Bishop g2, defending against this threat. Here, Alekhine finds a very interesting 10-move combination. It starts with bishop e6, attacking the rook on c4, and freeing up g4 square for this knight. Rook c2, putting pressure on these both knights. Knight g4 check, king h3. King h1 is not really possible because of both knight takes on g3 and rook a1 check. So instead of that, white plays king h3, knight e5, discovered check. The king goes back to h2, and rook f2, giving up the exchange. However, white cannot capture on f3 because after knight f3 and knight d2, black ends up with extra material. So white takes on e2 instead. The knight is under attack, the rook is under attack. Knight g4 check, king h3. Again, king cannot go to the first rank because of rook a1 check, bishop f1, and rook f1 with extra material. So white has to go to h3. And now knight e3 check, king h2, knight c2, bishop f3, knight d4. In this position, white resigned. The knight attacks two pieces. The only way not to lose one of them is to either play rook e3 or rook f2. In either one of those cases, knight takes f3, rook takes f3, and bishop d5, attacking both the rook and the knight, and also controlling the only square from which the rook can defend this knight. And after bishop d5, black ends up losing material and the game. So in the position after knight d4, Reti resigned. Let's recap this game. So when the position with the open center was reached, both sides started by fighting for the control of the center, of the open files and diagonals. After that, both sides tried to create weaknesses in the opponent's position. Black was trying to create a weakness on g3 and a2, and white was trying to create a weakness on c6. At one point, white had the opportunity to play e4, chase away the black knight from the central square on d5, and take control of the center. But white didn't use this opportunity and instead continued with his attack on the queen side. However, the attack on the king side by black was just faster and more dangerous, and eventually white won. The next game was taken from the World Championship match between Alexander Alekhine, who played white in this game, and Max Euwe, who played black. Here we again have a position with an open center, and in the next couple of moves, both sides are fighting for the control of the center and open files. Alekhine continued with queen c2, opening up d1 square for one of the rooks, and also creating a threat of transitioning the knight from c3 to d4 via b5, using the fact that the queen is pinned. Rook d8, black takes control over the open d file. Rook fd1, fighting for that control back. Castle, knight b5. Here's the maneuver that I mentioned earlier to transition the knight to d4. In this position, black took the rook on d1, and after rook d1, basically gave up the d file without a fight. He should have kept the rooks on d8 and d1 and instead played either queen a5 or queen b8, maintaining control of the open d file. After rook d1, queen a5, the knight heads back to d4. Now there's a threat of taking on a6, and after pawn takes e6, black has a weakness on a6. It's an open position. White has two bishops, so white is going to have an advantage. So to prevent that, black goes bishop c8. Alekhine plays b4. So this might look like a pawn attack on the queen side, but it's not. This move was made with the idea of controlling the center, which we will see in a couple of moves. Black cannot capture on b4 because the knight on a5 is going to be hanging. So black retreats to c7, and white continues with b5. After c5, we now see the idea behind Alekhine's move b4. He wanted to control the square on d5, and now the knight from d4 is going to be once again repositioned to e3, where it can control d5. So knight f5, black plays f6. Here's another mistake by black. Any move with a pawn creates a weakness. What happened with white when white played b4 and b5 and gained some advantage for weakening the pawn structure, which is the square on d5, With the move on f6, black doesn't gain any advantage and only weakens light squares around the king. Knight e3, heading to d5, bishop e6, and bishop d5. Notice that this bishop is the only piece that now defends light squares for black, and white is trading this bishop. Bishop takes, rook takes. Queen a5. Knight f5. Using the fact that light squares are weak, white is placing his pieces on light squares. Queen e1 check, king g2, and bishop d8. The bishop was under attack, so it retreats on d8. Bishop takes on e5. White exchanged a strong knight on e5 and also removes the defender of the d7 square. And after this exchange, the rook can go on d7, creating threats on the 7th rank. Bishop f6, defending the pawn on g7. Knight h6 check. Black cannot capture on h6 because of queen h7 checkmate. And so has to go king h8. Queen c5, attacking the rook on f8. Rook b8 and queen c4. The threat is now very simple. Queen g8, rook g8, and knight f7 checkmate. So black took on h6, and after queen f7, black resigned. So let's recap this game. A position with an open center was reached. Both sides started to fight for the control of the center and open files. The position was mostly even, but then black made two mistakes. The first mistake was giving up the open d file without a fight, and the second mistake was playing f6 and weakening light squares without gaining any benefit. In its turn, Alekhine fought for the control of the center, then played b4 and b5, provoking or forcing black to play c5 and giving white the control of the d5 square. So combining all of those factors, the control over the center from the white side, control of the d file, and creating weaknesses in black's position, white got a big advantage and finished the game off with a nice attack. The last game we're going to look at was played during a candidates tournament between two world champions. One was Vasily Smyslov, who already lost his chess crown, and the other one was Mikhail Tal, who was on his way to win it. Let's look at the game. Tal was playing white and Smyslov was playing black. The game started with a Caracan defense. Now, if you're Tal, who's playing a very aggressive, very active style, and you face a move like c6, which leads to very positional play, you will want to find different ways of switching gears and shifting the game into a more tactical position. So Tal played d3. After d5, knight d2, e5, knight f3, knight e7, he played d4, completely shifting the gears of the game. After pawn takes on a4, knight takes on a4, pawn takes on d4, and queen d4, we are now in a very open position with a lot of tactical possibilities. And this is what Tal wanted to do. Knight f6, challenging the knight on e4, fighting for the control over the center. Bishop g4, pinning the knight, preventing the trade. Bishop e7, castle, getting the king into the safety and adding to the control of the open d file. If we look at this position, we can see that white is ahead in development. White's pieces are very active. Black still has the queen side that hasn't been developed. White controls the center and the open d file, and this gives white an advantage, and Tal uses this advantage to start an attack. Knight d6, starting to put pressure pretty much everywhere in black camp. Queen a5, bishop c4, putting more pressure on the king's side. b5, a very tricky move. Now chasing the bishop from the strong diagonal, and the bishop doesn't really have any good moves. If bishop goes to b3, then after c5, queen goes, let's say, to d2, trade on d2, and c4, the white bishop is trapped, and black is up a piece. If, on the other hand, white doesn't play bishop b3, but plays bishop d3 or bishop e2, then black can capture on a2, grabbing an extra pawn and starting an attack on the queen side. But Tal had no desire to retreat his bishop. Instead, he played bishop d2, attacking the queen on a5. This move actually has a couple of different ideas besides attacking the queen. Tal is repositioning this bishop to c3 to this long diagonal where it is going to be way more active than on g5 and attacking the black king. He is also freeing up g5 square for his other pieces, for example, the queen. So after bishop d2, black queen retreated to a6. Knight f5, creating more threats, attacking the bishop on e7. Bishop d8, retreating the bishop in a defensive manner. If black were to play, let's say, bishop c5, trying to be aggressive and attack. Queen h4, giving up the bishop on c4. Pawn takes the bishop, and bishop c3, creating multiple threats, such as knight g7 or knight h6, with a lot of potential and dangerous attack. So because of that, black retreated to d8, but still, white doesn't worry about the bishop on c4. White believes that black doesn't have time to capture the bishop because white creates a lot of threats on the king's side. But Smyslov wasn't so keen on that attack. He says, I'm going to grab this bishop and you can prove to me that your attack actually has something going for it. Queen g5, threatening a checkmate. There aren't that many good ways to defend against the checkmate. Let's say g6, then bishop c3, creating a lot of threats. So let's say queen a2, knight h6 check, king h8, rook d7, bishop d7, and bishop f6 with a checkmate. A lot of dangerous threats. So g6 is just weakening the dark squares, and obviously Smyslov didn't want to do it. You can't retreat with the knight to e7 to defend this pawn because queen can simply capture on d8. So the only move that remains here is knight h5. The idea here is that if white takes on h5, then black can capture on a2, and if white plays bishop f6, then after knight f6, this knight simply defends everything, attacks the queen, and blocks the bishop. And so because of this, Tal could not capture on h5. Instead, he played knight h6 check, king h8, and now he captures on h5. Queen a2, bishop c3, creating more threats against the black king. Knight f6, defending, blocking the bishop, attacking the queen, and trying to defend his king. But here's a very nice blow. Queen f7, using the fact that black cannot capture the queen because of rook d8, knight g8, and then either knight f7 or rook g8 with a checkmate. So after queen f7, black cannot capture, but black can give a check on e1, king d2. Now the pass for the rook is blocked, and black can capture on f7. However, after knight f7 check, king g8, and rook a1, king f7, white has an extra exchange, and a couple of moves later, black resigned. So here we had a very interesting game, very tactical game, where Tal had a very good position out of the opening. He controlled the center, he controlled the open d file, and he was ahead in development. And he used all of those three factors to start a very dangerous attack on the black king, and eventually succeeded. We just looked at several examples of how world champions handle positions with an open center. All games followed pretty much the same pattern. The first stage was very aggressive maneuvering with the goal of controlling the center, controlling open files and diagonals. And the second stage was using this advantage, using this control to mount an attack against the opponent position. If you've learned something new, if you like this video, please let me know in the comments and hit that like button. If you haven't seen my introductory video where I talk about 5 different types of pawn structures in the center and how to play them, the link is right here and in the description. this is your first time here, consider subscribing. And if you have any follow-up questions or any other chess-related questions, jump into my stream. It's a very good place to get them answered. It's also a very good place to play some chess. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.